Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be teaching you how to graph sine and cosine. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the equation and the parts of the equation. So for sine and cosine it's the same. They're both going to be y equals, or f of x equals, a times sine of bx plus c, and then plus d. And the difference between Algebra 2 and Pre-Calculus is in Pre-Calc we leave it as the bx plus c, which doesn't necessarily matter. Cosine, same thing, y equals a times cosine of bx plus c plus d. So now we want to talk about what each letter is going to represent, and we're not going to do all of them today, we're just going to do some of them. So the first one we are going to talk about today is the amplitude, which hopefully you remember is that a value. So the absolute value of a is going to be the amplitude. Except amplitude is spelled with a D. Alright, so then the next thing we're going to talk about is the period. And the period comes from that b value. So 2 pi divided by b will give us the period. For now, we're not really going to care about C. We'll focus on that on Monday. And D, hopefully you remember that one's a pretty easy one. D is the midline, or the sinusoidal axis. So y equals D gives us, I'll just call it the midline for now. And the only thing we might want to also mention is just with the amplitude, if a is less than 0, it's reflected over the x-axis. So today we're going to be talking about graphing. So let's go through the steps for graphing. Steps for graphing. All right. So first step, or at least, I don't know, make sure you do all of these things. So first step, calculate the period usually. Then we want to find the critical point spacing. So remember, the critical points are going to be the points that we need to plot. That's going to be the min-max, or the points that are at the min, the max, and the sinusoidal axis. Make sure you write either sinusoidal or the midline so that you don't confuse it with the x or y axis. The next thing we need to make sure we do is label your starting point. That one's really important. You will lose points if you forget it. And then the fourth thing is to graph 2 cycles. All right. Did I miss anything? The only other thing, well, I guess finding the critical points. So how you find that is pretty simple. You're going to take your period and you're going to divide that by 4 because there are 4 critical points before it starts to go through another cycle. So remember, we either go axis max, axis min, and then it starts to repeat axis max, axis min, or we start at the max. So what we're going to do now is an example. We're going to start off simple and just review how to graph sine. So for sine of x, I like making a list, and actually sometimes I'm going to require that you guys do, so you might as well practice now. So I usually start with the axis, and when we look at the equation, since we're not adding or subtracting anything, the axis will just be at y equals 0. The amplitude is based off that a value, which there isn't any because this is the parent, so it's 1. The period, which is based off the b value, which the b value is 1, so 2 pi divided by 1 is 2 pi. And then the scale, to find those critical points, or the distance between the critical points. And remember, you take your period, which is 2 pi, and you divide it by 4, which is equal to pi over 2, which should make perfect sense because that's the unit circle, right? We go 0 and then pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. So you notice I've given us a blank coordinate plane. We need to label it. I like to space them out if I can. So because our scale is pi over 2, I'm going to do every other. So I'm going to have it start here as pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Then I'm also going to go the opposite way to our negatives. Alright, and I just said 2 cycles, but our coordinate plane's bigger, so you could keep labeling or we could just plot them. So let's just get to it. Oh, I forgot the x-axis, or y-axis, sorry. Our amplitude's 1, so I don't know, we got space, so I'm going to make it all the way up here. Alright, now let's graph it. So sine of x. Sine at 0, remember, has a y value of 0. So, because remember, x represents our angle. That is our starting point, which you should circle and write the coordinates of. Then, at pi over 2, we have a y value of 1. So we're going to go axis max, and then back to the axis, then down to the min, then back to the axis. And that's one cycle. And then we can keep going because we got the space. So max, axis, min. And I should also go the other way. So down to the minimum, back to the axis, to the max, to the axis, down to the minimum, to the axis, and max. And now we're going to connect these using curves, which it needs to look curved. If it looks zigzaggy at all, you will lose points. Don't forget those arrows. And then even though we're ending at a max and a min on this graph, we have to make sure we show that it's turning back up or back down. And the only other thing that I have forgotten is the axis, which is at y equals 0. So make sure you graph it. So the requirements are labeling the starting point, plotting, well, taking up your whole window if I give you a coordinate plane, and labeling your axis. Let's move on to the second example. So for this one, it's just cosine. Cosine starts, oh my goodness, at the maximum. And then we're going to go through the same list. So axis, not adding anything, so it's at y equals 0. The amplitude is 1. The period is 2 pi. And the scale is also going to be pi over 2. Alright, so the only difference here is that we start at the max. So I'm going to label my coordinate plane with the scale pi over 2. And we could keep going if we want. So at 3 pi over 2, so 5 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2. And then just for the interest of time, I'm going to stop. So I'm going to go back to my graph. And because this is cosine, when the angle is 0, we have cosine of 0 is 1. So max is our starting point. Circle it, write the coordinates 0, 0. And then head down to your axis, your min, your axis, your max, your axis, your min, etc. This is the quiet part while we all focus on plotting our points and making sure we're counting correctly. So, alright, connect that using nice curves, which hopefully yours look a little bit better than me drawing on my surface. Oh, that was bad. Okay, and we are good. So, oh no, we're not. I almost forgot again. I am tired, guys. Okay. So, did we label our starting point? Yes. Did we make our scale? Yes. Did we graph at least 2 periods? Yes. And did we label our axis? Yes. So, we're going to move on to another type of example. Describe how the graphs of f of x, which is just cosine of x, and g of x, which is -3 cosine of x, are related. So this is super simple. It is just understanding the transformations, essentially, with one exception. This is also going to be the next new thing. We're not going to call them dilations. We are going to just talk about how it's going to affect the graph. So first, let's start with the reflection. So that negative is still going to reflect over the x-axis. You need to use the word reflect, you can't use the word flip, and you need to make sure you're being specific about the axis. And then for that -3, it is affecting vertically. It's going to affect the amplitude. So we're going to say vertically, and because it's 3, it's going to expand it. You don't even have to say what it's by, you just need to say vertically expand. And if it was 1/3, you'd say compress. So let's move on to example 4.